Thank you for the invitation, because dance is usually left out, of course, when you speak about the arts and exile. So, Kurt Jooss. Here's a portrait of him. The choreographer, dancer, and teacher Kurt Jooss did not come to Cambridge voluntarily. It was not the place he had chosen when he went into exile from Nazi Germany. Jooss arrived in Cambridge in 1940. It was November, the month when the town is at its most miserable. Dark, damp, uncomfortable, unwelcoming, and it might have been the perfect metaphor for Jooss's situation. He came to Cambridge because he had nowhere else to go. How had this situation come about? Kurt Jooss, who was born in Heilbronn in 1901, had been the choreographer of the ballet section of the Opera House in Essen. He had been the director of the Volkwang School, also in Essen, and the director of his own company. And in 1932, he had won the most prestigious prize, the gold medal, at the International Choreography Competition in Paris with his piece, Der grüne Tisch, the green table. And that's what he's known for today. When the Nazis rose to power, he was not looked at disapprovingly by the propaganda ministry, who recognized a potentially useful artist for the campaign of finding a modernist dance expression to the Nazi movement. All he had to do in order to gain favor was sack his Jewish composer, Fritz Cohen, and get rid of a few Jewish ensemble members. Neither his teacher, Rudolf von Laban, the inventor of the German modern dance, to which also Jooss belonged, nor the most famous performer at the time, Mary Wiegmann, found that at all difficult. Laban became an employee of the Goebbels ministry in 1934 and dismissed all Jewish dancers from and even refused to teach Jewish children at the State Opera Berlin and had them removed from dance instruction, long before the order to do so was issued by the Nazi administration. Wiegmann demanded the acceptance of the Aryan paragraph and made proof of racial purity school policy, also long before the Nazi administration made it a legal requirement for teaching in private schools. As my colleague and friend Laure Gilbert comments, Laban, Wiegmann, and the Nazis shared the same artistic visions and goals, unquote. But Jooss refused. He refused to sack Cohen, and he refused to dismiss his Jewish dancers. Therefore, a vicious campaign against him was launched. He was driven out of Essen, out of his position, and out of Germany. His entire group left, though a few members returned to Nazi Germany when life in exile became too difficult. The ensemble as a whole, and this is absolutely unique in the history of dance, moved to the Netherlands and began to tour Europe with the already legendary Green Table. In 1934, Dorothy and Leonard Elmhirst invited Jooss and his ensemble to join the faculty at Dartington Hall. Jooss accepted, and it seemed as though he had found a new home where he could settle down, teach, choreograph, and perform. This would be the place where he could further develop his new concept of Tanztheater, which is not correctly translated with dance theater because it doesn't capture the idea. A genre that attempted to bridge the gap between modern dance and classical ballet in order to create a new type of dance drama for the stage. This synthesis of old and new would combine the radical modernist spatial and technical aspects of modern German dance with the narrative and dramatic style of ballet. Jooss wanted to bring the modern dance concept to the theatrical stage and force ballet into a modernization process. And Dartington Hall allowed him further experimentation and the mapping of a teaching, performing career that he had lost in Nazi Germany, yet urgently needed to continue professionally. Dartington Hall also came closest to the cultural performance traditions of Germany with its distinct theatrical cultivation. Things in Dartington Hall seemed to go well. Jooss worked for his company, the Ballet Jooss. He also developed the teaching section with his close friend and colleague Sigurd Leder. But there were difficulties and resentments. Why should the British and English ballet system accept this German choreographer with his weird ideas? Britain was developing its own modern ballet. There was Ninette de Valois, who had worked with the Ballet Russe from 1923 to 1926, and in 1927 she established the Academy of Choreographic Art in London, a forerunner of the Royal Ballet. She worked for the Old Vic Theatre and then for Sadler's Wells in London. Her company performed the classical Russian repertoire and also the many new works choreographed by her or the rising star Frederick Ashton. Then there was Mary Rambert, born in Warsaw into a Jewish family. She had studied with Emile Jacques Dalcroze in his Geneva school. On recommendation of Jacques Dalcroze, Diaghilev, the manager of the Ballet Russe, had hired her in 1912 to teach the company members a better sense of rhythm so that they could cope with Václav Nijinsky's complicated scores, particularly with Sacre du Printemps, the scandal of 1913. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, she moved to Britain and opened her own dancing school in 1920. She formed a company which became the Ballet Club, renamed in 1935 Ballet Rambert. Frederick Ashton had initially been her student, and she, like Ninette de Valois, stood for modern British ballet, a ballet that was driven by the modernist aesthetics of the Russian and Swedish experiments of the 1910s and 20s, yet also acknowledged the romantic and classical traditions of the 19th century. There existed a third powerful influence that would become much stronger from the late 1930s onwards, and that was the philosophy and practice of German modern dance. Laban's British students spread his theories mainly by teaching them, yet also combining them with choreography. Laban's claims of exclusivity, the claims that only his German dance theories followed or uncovered eternal laws of nature and harmony, the spatial and communal aspects cultivated together with a deeply problematic eugenic racial ideology deepened the confrontation and exacerbated the animosity between ballet and modern dance aesthetics. To the question of preferable dance aesthetics was added a more immediate and vexed aspect, the accusation that immigrants were taking away employment from British artists. Jooss was indeed preventing British artists from maintaining jobs, and this was not just a rhetorical formulation. Jooss's presence made Margaret Barr leave Dartington Hall, a choreographer and dancer who had taught there since 1930. Jooss had come with his own group, and Barr did not fit into the professional ethics and aesthetics of the German modern dance concept. Barr's approach, that she called dance mime, was too amateurish for Jooss's taste. She also conveyed overt political messages, was close to the communist ideologies, and used British contemporary composers like Michael Tippett, for instance. Though her dance mime was in many ways closely related to Jooss's dance drama of Tanztheater, the differences were considered on both sides as too great, and they lay not only in the professional versus amateur aesthetics. Barr's lack of Germanness in her dance theory and her overt left-wing politics would not have endeared her to Jooss and to Leder. Jooss, throughout his career, was faithful to Laban's theories and also considered art to be apolitical, a paradoxical notion in the context of the Green Table or the works he would create later in Cambridge. The fruitful and productive period in Dartington Hall ended in the late 1930s and early 1940s. There had been other tensions and problems. The rescue of Rudolf von Laban in 1937 by Kurt Jooss and another student, Lisa Ullmann, and his accommodation in Dartington Hall introduced a gradual alienation between the Elmhursts and Jooss, whose existence depended on them. Laban had run afoul of the Nazi system that he had facilitated, and he now needed help, and Jooss gave it. The Elmhursts were deeply impressed with Laban, even though he had enthusiastically supported the Nazi regime. Laban had charisma, Jooss was a decent man, not without charm, but not with the same aura as his teacher. By 1939, Jooss was seriously confused because he did not understand the change in the relationship. But in the end, the Elmhursts admired Laban more than they were loyal to Jooss. But that in the end is another story. Then there was the blow of the Ballet Jooss breaking up. In 1939, the group had started an extensive tour of North and South America, but could not travel back to Europe and unite because of the outbreak of World War II. Cohen and the group performing in the Americas were prevented from returning to Britain. Jooss in Britain could not join his group as he was not allowed to enter the United States. And further disaster struck. Jooss and Leder were classified as enemy aliens, Class C, and in mid-June, Jooss was arrested, taken to Huyton, and then interned on the Isle of Man. Leder was also interned on the Isle of Man. Hein Heckroth, the set designer for the Ballet Jooss, was sent to Australia and interned in Hay in New South Wales. How was Jooss to work creatively under such extreme circumstances? How was he to continue an experiment and what the dance historian Coton called the line of progress that Coton saw as the most substantial in the 20th century? Coton compared Jooss to Nevers in the 18th century and to Fouquin in the early 20th century, and that was praise and appreciation, but also a tremendous burden. Jooss had to fulfill this promise, and in the late 1930s and in the 40s, that seemed extremely difficult to achieve. The following remarks trace Jooss's development during and just after the internment period, and I would like to suggest that the main, in fact, the vital support came from John Maynard Keynes. Without him, Jooss would not have survived. He would not have been able, mentally and physically, to continue his choreographic project. Keynes recognized already in 1935, years before the historian Coton summarized the innovation of Tanztheater, that Jooss had an unusually powerful imagination and that the Tanztheater genre was historically vital and necessary for the further modernization of stage dance. These comments, therefore, are about Jooss as much as they are about Keynes. Beside Keynes, another professional link to Cambridge existed, that to Edward Dent, the musicologist at King's College and the president of the International Society of Contemporary Music. Jooss had consulted Dent's version of Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas for his production in Münster in 1926, and they had been in contact ever since, and on increasingly friendly terms, as the animated correspondence confirmed. Dent also helped relocate Jooss's wife Aino, a dancer in the Jooss company, and the daughter Anna, to relocate from London to Cambridge. John Maynard Keynes and his wife, the ballet russe ballerina Lydia Lopachova, had been acquainted with Jooss since 1935. They were, as mentioned, immediately impressed with his new idea of Tanztheater, and they realized the potential of this new genre also for the performance scene in Britain. Their admiration for the artists they encountered often turned into practical support, and they were able, in Jooss's case, to find ways of integrating him into the British performance scene. That does not mean that Keynes accepted Jooss's work unconditionally. In a letter to Dorothy Elmhurst, who had invited the Keyneses to the Ballet Jooss performance in September 1935 in London, John Maynard Keynes commented that Ballade, one of the works presented, and I quote, was very good indeed and more satisfying in the long run than it appeared first. We think there is great beauty and flavor of originality in this. It may not be a popular success, though one never knows, but it should certainly be kept in the program at all costs. Perhaps its special flavor will grow on everyone's taste. But Mirror has to be seen a little bit more critically. Jooss, by the choice of medium, has put an enormous strain on his own invention and imagination, unquote. Keynes's insights reveal a trope, that of Jooss's inability to work in a different institutional environment and to translate the dramatic narrative into adequate movement. He also points to another problem, that Jooss could not master the dramatic impetus that he had initiated. It's the trope of losing control over one's creation. Keynes's reservations reappeared again and again later in the dancer reviews by professional critics. It is just remarkable that Keynes and Lopochova realized Jooss's limits as early as 1935, yet hoped he would overcome them. Though Jooss's works met with mixed and then fading success, as Keynes had predicted, he supported the choreographer without reserve and invited the ensemble to perform in the newly established Cambridge Arts Theatre. Keynes and Lopochova cultivated modern ballet systematically. It's in fact the art form Lopochova for obvious reasons, but Keynes also were most interested in, more than drama, more than opera. With Jooss, Ninette de Valois, and Mary Rambert were the beneficiaries of this encouragement. All three groups became a fixed part of the Arts Theatre's annual planning. Some appearances of the ballet Jooss, those for 1936, did not materialize, but Jooss presented several of his pieces in Cambridge later in 1938. The ballet Jooss gave 2 sets of 8 performances, and in 1939 there were 11 performances in the Arts Theatre, which is a substantial amount. Kronecker, to music by the German-Jewish refugee composer Bertolt Goldschmidt, saw its first performance in Cambridge on the 14th of February 1939, before the outbreak of World War II and the breakup of the group. In December 1939, the Green Table was performed for the 900th time during a gala performance for the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, and with great success. Keynes opened the gala matinee on the 12th of December 1939 with a speech, a paean, I quote, to the most famous and distinguished of German ballets in the midst of war against Germany, unquote. The Jooss ballet and the more than 1,000 Germans in exile in Cambridge attested to the fact that this was not a war between nations or imperialism, but between fundamental ways of life, and it was a matter of saving civilization. For Keynes, Jooss represented the other, the better Germany, and for that reason alone he had to be praised and his art had to be sustained. That Jooss performed the role of death added to the importance of the occasion, though that was the result of the lack of male dancers as much as recognition of a highly unusual and significant event. But this Scala performance was an example of Jooss's anti-Nazi stance. He never wavered and remained opposed to the Nazi regime. As mentioned, Jooss and Leder were interned, and it was Keynes who secured Jooss's release from internment in November 1940. Here's a brief overview how exactly Keynes accomplished Jooss's discharge, and I'm condensing literally hundreds and hundreds of letters. It should be first mentioned that Keynes had been asked by Jooss in April 1939 to act as sponsor and write a reference for his naturalization application, and so was already involved in stabilizing Jooss's place in British society. Keynes agreed, but warned Jooss that he was entering, I quote, a process that takes a good long time, unquote. That process was interrupted by the outbreak of war and the classification of many German refugees as enemy aliens. As soon as Jooss was interned, Keynes applied for his release. When Alfred Glucksmann, the German-Jewish scientist in Cambridge, wrote to Keynes in September asking to help Jooss, Keynes replied with surprise, I quote, I was assuming that Mr. Jooss's application to be allowed to leave the country, which I supported, had been duly granted. Considerable confusion has been caused by Jooss having changed his mind without telling any of his friends, whilst the application to join his ballet in South America was going forward, and in effect he withdrew this application, substituting quite a different one. His friends will certainly not leave the matter alone, though, unquote. The change of application by Jooss had created a case not so much of barbed wires, but crossed wires, according to Keynes. And he told Glucksmann so. Keynes immediately got in touch with the Dartington Trust, and it emerged that Jooss had indeed not told anyone, not the trustees, nor the Elmhursts, nor the arts director, that he had sent another very different application to the Home Office. And that generated much perplexity and annoyance, but also anger at the obtuseness of the Home Office. The first release application had been drafted by the Dartington Trust with the request that Jooss be allowed to leave the country in order to join his ballet Jooss in Argentina, as he wanted. It was rejected by the Home Office, and the condition for reconsideration rested on acceptance of the clause of giving up the right to return Britain, in brackets, hostile environment. Jooss initially agreed to the clause. A follow-up application was sent by the Dartington Trust as well as the Foreign Office on his behalf, but at the same time, and while interned in the camp on the Isle of Man, Jooss, driven by anxiety and fear, changed his mind, refused the no-return option, and sent a second application for unconditional release under Category 19. The muddle, as Keynes called it, caused great problems, meant that the Dartington Trust and Keynes had to rethink strategies and restart negotiations with the Home Office. They did, and the end successfully. But this muddle also meant that Jooss was not released in September or October, but only in November, and that was still being lucky. But the attempt by Jooss to fight for his release under all circumstances has to also be understood in the context of the changing of application rules by the Home Office, by misinformation, by partial and incorrect information, by extreme fear, even hysteria in the camps, and the hopelessness of the internee. Soma Morgenstern, the Jewish music critic and writer, interned at the same time in France, described that specific frame of mind into which the internee slips, a self-destructiveness by losing the ability to remember. It's a destruction of the core identity of any human being. And that is, I think, what happened to Jooss. Meanwhile, Keynes had encouraged the formation of professional societies for artists that would follow the example of the lawyers, doctors, and scientists' help associations, though he thought that the fracturing of interests and thereby the weakening of the attempts to fight against the system that had declared refugees enemy aliens in the first place was regrettable. The extensive correspondence between Keynes, the Dartington trustees, the lawyers of the trustees, the Elmhursts, the arts director, Miss Simpson, we've heard from her, and Edward Dent and others demonstrates the enormous efforts that were taken to free Jooss and Leder. And this was only one case of very many. It was not only Jooss who needed help and who was desperate, but hundreds of other refugees decried as enemy aliens. Glucksmann, for instance, after intervening on Jooss's behalf, was then interned himself and shipped to Canada, and he returned only after the war. Keynes was pragmatic and advised the Dartington Trust how best to proceed. He suggested 3 strategies. Ask for release on the grounds of Category 19, first. Second, send a reminder that the Home Office had already agreed to the release and insist on it. And third, the application on the grounds that professional groups that recruited artists like Jooss could further the war effort. And then, of course, there was still a system in place where one good chap could phone another good chap, and that conversation would actually help to resolve a problem. And the minutes in the Keynes archive describe this, how this happened. Finally, Jooss was released in November. Return to Dartington Hall was impossible because it had become protected military territory and the army had confiscated Jooss's house. And yet again, it was Keynes who supported Jooss and invited him to come to Cambridge to teach and prepare performances, such as the Green Table for the Arts Theatre. He also guaranteed a small grant. And so Jooss moved to Cambridge, first to Clarkson Road. Then after Christmas, the family left the flat because the rent became too high. And on invitation of Alice Rowton, Jooss and his family lived in 9 Adams Road. The largest space in the house, the entry hall, was converted into a studio and performance place, and the plans to establish a dance school with Zico Leder were first conceived of there, and this is one of the flyers they had. In 1943, Jooss was able to move to the house number 14, Madingley Road, and he earned a bit of money by letting several rooms. Though Jooss could work again, the conditions were difficult and he struggled. Yes, he had a place to live, a space to work, a theatre willing to perform his works, and an agency, the Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts, CIMA, and its chairman, John Maynard Keynes, to provide financial grants. He shared the Arts Theatre with Ninette Valois, the Ballet Rambert, with the Anglo-Polish Ballet, and an old colleague from Germany, Alexander von Zwein. And his story too is interesting because he wanted to settle in Cambridge, then decided against it, went back to Nazi Germany, was persecuted for his homosexuality, and then went on to Indonesia. A note by Keynes summarized the state of affairs and the threat from Dartington that if Jooss did not find financial means himself, he would have to start earning his living as a fire watcher or a clerk. Keynes put into words Jooss's existential exile condition. I quote, "The difficulty, as I understand it, has been that Jooss's work has been so much disturbed by his anxiety to rejoin his company in America and the perpetual uncertainty as to whether he will be able to do so. In the summer, he had made elaborate arrangements for a vacation school of dancing. He then had to give this up because he thought he was going to America. At the last moment, this proved impossible. He is still in the position, I gather, of not knowing from day to day whether he can get off. If he were definitely to give up the idea of joining the company in America, I think it would be much easier for him to earn a living. On the other hand, this would be a wrong decision for him to make. Until this matter is settled one way or the other, I do not see how he can make very satisfactory arrangements. I venture to express the strong hope that the Dartington Hall trustees will continue their generosity to him. He has been in great distress what to do and has been most conscientiously following what he thought right and best. But difficulties of passports, passages, and the rest have led to endless disappointment. I suppose you can tell him that he must get work as a fire watcher or something of that sort, or take a job as a clerk, which no doubt he could do, but I should rather be sorry to hear that this has happened," unquote. The Dartington Trust did not extend its generosity. It ended its endowment, which was meager enough, and the administrator wrote to Keynes, I quote, "I ought to get in touch with Jooss and tell him that he should look elsewhere for work, as he will have to stand on his own feet before very long and make himself self-supporting," unquote. So Keynes stepped in again, and he wrote back to Dartington, "You may be interested to know that we expect to be able to find a modest but interesting job for Jooss at Cambridge. The Arts Theatre Trust, of which, of course, John Maynard Keynes was the chairman, has decided to present Sadler's Wells Opera with a new production of The Magic Flute in commemoration of Mozart's 150 years. This is to be done under the general direction of Professor Dent, but we are inviting Jooss to act as producer and he will receive a suitable fee," unquote. Now, there are two ways of looking at Jooss's predicament. First, and I put this very crudely, first, Jooss was in an impossible situation. The exile condition, poor, struggling professionally and financially in Cambridge, that did not have a strong dance tradition, undermined any artistic ambitions. That he managed to create 2 new ballets while he lived in Cambridge, that he managed to stage them and tour the country during much of the years of 43, 44, and 45 and uphold a repertoire is testament to his artistic and moral strength. The second way of looking at it is this. Jooss might have been in a challenging position, but he had much more support than most other dancers and choreographers. Many of the dance performers in exile had no hope whatsoever to live off their professions. Dancing was a luxury and a dream. Not entirely so for Jooss. Even though he had never-ending support from Keynes, he only created 2 new ballets in Cambridge. Beside the first performance of Chronica in 1939, that was pre-war, there was Company at the Manor in 1943 and Pandora to the music of Roberto Gerhardt, we've heard about it, in 1944. But none of these ballets has lasted beyond Jooss's lifetime. So, since 1939, Jooss had been in a crisis, and he actually never really recovered from it. On the 21st of April, 1946, John Maynard Keynes died in the middle of the negotiations for the establishment of an international monetary system and an Anglo-American loan. Britain was broke. And Jooss lost his most important pillar of support and encouragement. After 1947, CIMA, now the Arts Council, was no longer willing to put money into the Ballet Jooss. In a letter, the Jooss wrote to Alice Rowton and to Lydia Lopachova, I quote, "The Arts Council severed their ties with us on account of our touring abroad. Our debts with them are still unpaid. Alice Rowton's financial position has become such that she cannot take responsibility for the situation." Unquote. The debt was between 200,000 and 500,000 £, so a substantial amount of money at the time. Dissatisfaction with his entire situation in Britain, constant money worries, the lack of a real acknowledgement of the Jooss Dance School in Cambridge, the waning success of the touring company that went bankrupt in the summer of 1947, but also serious aesthetic problems, unresolved problems of collaboration and choreographic creation made him radically rethink his life and career options in Britain. Sigurd Leder split from Jooss and set up his school in London on his own. Jooss left Cambridge and Great Britain, first to join the fragments of his group in South America, in Chile, in 1948. And in 1949, he returned to Germany, to Essen and the Folkwang as a British citizen and as the representative of the past that needed to be overcome. This is a formulation from a German colleague, and if it is enigmatic, you are right. He was not welcomed back with enthusiasm by his former colleagues, not at all. He remained in between, suspended and uprooted. He could again not shake the existential exile condition. The triumph of the Green Table he could never replicate. Jooss's concept of Tanztheater left Britain with him and did not take roots in Britain. But his post-war school in Essen became the nursery for the next generation of German Tanztheater choreographers. And it was his student Pina Bausch who reintroduced British audiences to Tanztheater, albeit in her interpretation of Jooss's original. Thank you.